It's really a thrill to welcome Renata Adler for her first appearance at Politics and Prose. She's here this evening to mark the publication of a collection of her nonfiction called After the Tall Timber, which includes early New Yorker pieces, film reviews, and a variety of essays from a wide range of publications, including Harper's, The New Republic, and the New York Review of Books. In addition to being one of the most astute and unflinching social critics of our time, she's also a novelist whose work inspires a cult-like devotion. And I'm here as Exhibit A of that. I remember being a 22-year-old kid just out of college, living in Los Angeles, reading Muriel Sparks' New York Times review of Pitch Dark, and picking up the phone and calling every bookstore in LA until I found a copy at Brentano's, got in my car, and drove straight there, and have been kind of carrying this beat-up book around the world for the last, I don't know how many years. I don't want to do the math, but it's really a thrill to have her here tonight. Much has been written about Adler, but one of my favorite things I came across was from The Believer, written about 3 years ago. She has fervent fans and bitter enemies, probably in equal number, and in certain bookish circles, she looms like an enigmatic specter, terrifying, absent, revered, and argued about, not quite of this world. And yet, she's very much of this world and here with us tonight. Please help me welcome Renata Adler.
Well, hi.
Do you want to go to the mic?
To the mic. Oh,
Yeah.
that's right. I thought
Yeah.
I was standing. It's much
Yeah.
better. Okay. Well, here we are. So I don't know what's interesting. If anything, I wanted to say I was writing my microphone's not on?
Should be on.
Or too close? Too?
Yeah,
Should I
you
shout?
Just talk closer to the mic.
Talk closer to the mic? Is it on? Okay.
Should work.
Okay. So you're right. I was writing a piece for about many months recently for actually this book. And I didn't finish it. I just missed my deadline. It was supposed to be everything I thought about anything, because I thought, and it had been quite a while since I'd published anything. I thought about anything. So this was going to be everything. And I thought I really had it, and I was going to call it Letter from Newtown, because I'm from Newtown, Connecticut. And I worked away, and then I didn't realize I was going to miss my deadline, and I did. I absolutely missed my deadline. But I'm still working on it. And one thing I noticed living out there in Newtown, and I don't know if it's true everywhere, it took me quite a while to notice, but I thought, wait, there are more and more flags. When I was growing up, there were flags on the 4th of July. There were flags in some greens. There were flags on some occasions. People put flags on their doors, 4th of July, whenever. And there were a few flags. That was it. We had Flag Day at school. I don't remember what Flag Day was for, but we were glad we went outside. It was the spring. And now, no matter what happens, there are more flags. And they're never removed. They're on telephone poles. I looked into it. Who puts them on the telephone poles? Well, it's the Lions Club in my town. Also on every picket of a picket fence. Is that true down here? I mean, more and more and more flags, and they never come down. And then it suddenly occurred to me the only thing that's producing these flags, or the thing that really began to produce them, in Newtown at least, was the event of December 14th, December 12th, whatever it was, when all the children were shot in our school, right? And the flags went out. Stars went out. I mean, little stars on houses and on lawns. And there were tents everywhere with teddy bears. And there was this strange occasion in this sort of nowhere town because these children had been shot. But then the flags went up. Why do you put up a flag when children are shot? And I thought it was then an expression of hope, maybe, or something. I mean, we're all here. People were wearing bracelets that said we are all Newtown, we choose love, all that kind of thing. But then I also noticed it had happened since 9/11. Flags started to go out in these unprecedented numbers on 9/11 and then 12/14. And the reason, I think, was they have become increasingly expressions not of triumph or maybe of patriotism, but it's changed. They are more and more expressions of resignation and solidarity and despair. And I wonder if that's true for all of you, because I'm almost sure it's true for me, and it's true almost up and down New England. What are they putting the flags up for? There's no triumph. Where has there been a triumph? It's not about war. Maybe some people are putting it up because they have sons there, or because they want to say something about their loyalty to the military. But this was never the meaning of the flag before. It was never something you put out because you were sad. And I think it's true. I think it's true. And I remembered that when I was in kindergarten, and so this was, World War II was just starting as far as the United States was concerned. And there was a little boy in my kindergarten class, a Japanese boy called Junior. And of course, in retrospect, his name was not Junior. And then he suddenly was taken out of kindergarten, and we were told he was going back to Japan with his parents. And my mother said, it's okay, he's going back to Japan with his parents. And he gave me a full-size American flag, 48 stars then, silk, folded beautifully, and he left. I mean, we were close. I mean, we loved each other. I mean, we were little kids, but we loved each other. So much that after the war, I thought, I'm going to look for Junior. And of course, I was old enough to know I wasn't going to find Junior. But I kept looking for Junior, because I thought through the Red Cross, or, the way displaced persons were finding each other and so on. I never, of course, did find him. But I thought, look, the flag then, he certainly was telling me something, or his parents were telling me something, or we were all telling each other something with a flag. And do any or all of you have flags? In fact, at this moment only, I'm wondering whether many, many more people have guns than flags. Because you have many, many guns in a household, possibly. You don't probably yet have many, many flags. Anyway, that leads, in a way, nowhere, but also somewhere, because I was lucky enough. I mean, when these pieces were written, I guess all of them, even about the impeachment of President Nixon, there was really reason for optimism. There were some good stories with good people in them. Even the bad people were not so bad. Now, I don't know about the rest of you, I didn't expect to say this, but now each time I vote, I feel guilty about what happens afterwards. That is, who do you vote for? What do you think? What do you do? All the certainties I had. I was lucky at the New Yorker in that I first came there, and my job, like everybody's job that I knew, was not clear. And then at a certain point, I was reviewing books anonymously, these little snips of things, and then there seemed to be something going on in the South, and I asked Mr. Shawn whether I could go on the Selma March. And he said, sure. I don't see why not. I mean, it wasn't reserved. In those days, you could reserve pieces. So E.J. Kahn had reserved all of Africa. So, I mean, over time, that hold was sort of loosened. But I went to Selma, and in those days, still one dressed up to go out. So I wore my high heels and my coat, my winter coat, and gloves, and I set out for Selma. And first of all, it would not have been appropriate in any case. It was a march. It was also hot. And high heels are not necessarily what you wear to a march. And so right as soon as we set out, I couldn't get a room anyplace because I looked like what I suppose in a way I was, an outside agitator from the North. And that turned out to be very lucky for me because I got to spend my nights and all my time with the march. And now looking at the piece again, I thought the piece was going to be embarrassing in ways that it is not. I mean, it's embarrassing in other ways, but not in that way. I mean, there are people in it now. I thought I was writing about an idea, a historical event, and so on, but there were really people there. And I was just talking to Susan about it. There's somebody who walks out. She's a sheriff's daughter, and she's called Stacy Hayden. And some whites have come to make trouble. It's really all they've come to do, and they have these quotes. And it's a problem I became aware of later, is that a quote that is right, that is accurate, and that is pretty good, leaps out at you as authentic. I mean, people say a lot of things that if you quote them, they don't sound authentic. I mean, but they are. And then people make up a lot of quotes that don't sound authentic, and they aren't. And it's very rare to be able to make up a quote that is authentic. And anyhow, how would you know? Because, of course, we trust them, we're reading. But there was this person called Stacey Hayden just coming out to meet these white people who were explaining that they had come out to stand for what they believed, and it was clearly trouble. It was really going to be trouble, and more people were pulling up, and she was so good. And in the interim, it occurred to me that she was Mrs. Tom Hayden in those days, who later became Mr. Jane Fonda. But what happened to Stacey Hayden, I have no idea. And there are all these people where I have no idea what became of them. But it was quite wonderful in that you had reason to believe. First of all, in the Second World War, you had reason to believe because there were good guys and bad guys, and the good guys won. And that was pretty good. And then in the civil rights movement in the South, there were good guys and bad guys, and the good guys won, and the good guys behaved so impeccably in retrospect. I mean, there was no violence on the part of blacks in the South. I mean, they were perfect. They spoke, it was a kind of perfection you couldn't expect and that wasn't necessary, but it was there. And so you have some solid foundation of things going well. And as far as I can see, they never went well again. In a way, in the impeachment inquiry with President Nixon, it was, everybody kept saying afterwards, everybody who was on the staff would say, well, the system worked, and they were all very cheerful. But there's never anything to cheer for in an impeachment, for sure. Never. And then there was the travesty of the Clinton impeachment, and there just hasn't. It maybe just has to do with getting older. There hasn't really been anything that one can say, well, all right, look, I'm really for this. I'm going to go for it. I'm going to follow it. It may make trouble for me in my personal life or my professional life, but this is where I'll go, and this is whom I'll follow. And I haven't seen it since. I haven't seen it at any level, certainly not. I think one turning point was the Bush Gore decision of the Supreme Court, which was, I think left the country completely transformed. It was I maybe could read from the beginning of that, but that I really think was the end of the country we had known. And of course, one says that a little bit too early because looking back at something that I read rather late in life, it was Chapters of Erie. I don't know if you've read it, but it's the best possible piece of muckraking, and it's from the Charles Francis Adams and his brother, and it's just such a scandal from beginning to end. It's corruption. It's the system was finished. The system was broken. But in retrospect, the railroads were built. Many wonderful things happened, and they. And then if you look back just before the Second World War, the country looked so terrible. All these people who should have known better were Nazis, and they were profiting from it. IBM was, Lindbergh was, it looked bleak. And then the country pulled itself together and was wonderful. But what did at that time was the war. And what I'm afraid is this next war is certainly not going to do that. There isn't going to be everybody suddenly pulling himself together and becoming a concerned citizen of the world or citizen of the country because we're at nuclear war. It's not going to work that way. And so I wonder, how the country pulls itself together again, if the country pulls itself together, or families or anybody. All right, I'll stop in a minute because it's so rambling. But there's this other thought that when you reach a certain age, you either do or do not have a certain stake in the way things are. That is, I don't want everybody to be mad at me ever again. Why? It's just, it's just trouble. And one has children and wants them to be safe in the world and nobody to say, and one doesn't want any trouble as one gets older. And and many young people don't want any trouble, and many young people only want trouble because it's part of being young. But then you have to be sort of lucky in the trouble that you want. And here, that investment in the way things are, that one just doesn't want to cross anybody, let alone everybody, is a very corrupting thing. That is, you have to be sort of very careful. Even before there was surveillance, and of course now there's surveillance, you have to be particularly careful what you say. And that wasn't here. That wasn't true here, or whom you follow, or what you do. Even in days of blacklisting, there was blacklisting. They were blacklisted for a reason. They shouldn't have been blacklisted. It's not the way our system works, and so on. But you could clean it up. You could straighten it out. There's no way. It really seems to me very scary. the situation in the country, and that's partly why I'm sort of ranting in this way. I'm not used to thinking everything is scary. But you look at the courts, they're terrible. I mean, not all the courts, the Supreme Court, I think. You look at the Supreme Court, it's not heartening thing. If you look at the executive branch of government, it seems to me more awful all the time. I mean, it seems to me it's been bad since we had W, and in a way we still have W. I didn't know that. I voted with other thoughts in mind. But it doesn't. I mean, these youngish-looking men who don't really. I mean, sort of the jaunty step and this isn't what it looks like. This is not what Harry Truman. This is not like what a serious human being looks like, really. Let alone a serious leader of men. This is sort of. I guess President Obama once used the word optics to describe a sort of tactless moment when he was playing golf, when there'd been some and I'd never heard the word optics before. But I thought, no, this isn't it. This is public relations, and this is ominous and not good. So that's the executive. And the Congress, well. So, okay, why don't I stop? Because I obviously not have anything to say, but I'm just overwhelmed with wanting to say something about everything. So, yes. Does anybody want to ask questions? Because otherwise I'll just go on. Yeah.
Howard, would you go to the mic? Would you mind going to the mic?
Oh,
Thank you.
Yes, come.
Thank you.
Oh, another mic. A different mic.
So the New York Review books, which I think is perhaps the most exciting thing going in publishing, just an opinion, resurrects, if you will, reinstates books that should be reinstated, and also publishes living writers. The gift of your book is that it gathers a wide variety of works. The frustration of the book is that I wish it was a collected nonfiction. So I'm asking you, the question is, how do you feel about having this book out, where it is the hope that it will lead people to find all of your work, which is still available, you can find it. And I've always wondered about what a selection would mean to a writer of your accomplishment, rather than everything being available, because it's both a very generous representation, but still by definition partial.
It's funny that you should say that, because it was sort of random which pieces got in.
Did you choose them?
I was allowed to choose them, sure, but I just didn't really pay that much attention. I thought, and then suddenly, I don't know if those of you who write, if you look back at prior work, at sometimes it seems so embarrassing that it's inconceivable that you wrote something so terrible, and at other times there's the question, how could you ever write that way again? I mean, Edmund Wilson used to do that at 3 a.m. He'd go and read his old pieces and think, oh, this is so wonderful, I can't do it anymore. And then other times think, no, this is so terrible. So it wasn't, so I didn't really want to read the pieces again, which I've just done. So and then it turns out I left out some that I wanted to put in, and I put in some that I wanted to leave out. But that changes all the time. But the way this began was not, oddly enough, with New York Review Books at all. It was with Melville House. And they said, why don't we just publish everything you've ever done? And I thought, all right, why not? It was great. But it never seemed to happen. We constantly met, and that was sort of what we did. And it was, and coming from Newtown is not so easy. You go to New York, you go to Greenwich Village, you meet for lunch, and then at the end of it, you go back again, and we talk again. Isn't this a wonderful idea? Let's by all means go ahead with it. And then New York Review came, and then I said to the guy at New York Review, and I said to New York Review, because I said, look, they're already spoken for. And then I said to this guy, I'd just been approached by, and he said, oh, thank God, as though he was going to publish them. But it turned out he didn't seem, was he going to, so that's how it happened. So it's largely, as so much is, just plain chance. Yeah, I didn't mean to, but yeah. And there's two things that really matter to me, too. I mean, they're more than two, in some ways less than two, but on the grand scale, there are two things that matter to me. One is the public view what's going on out there. And the other is the sentence for sentence, word for word view. Do I want this? Do I not want this? What is the sentence doing here? So I looked back for a sentence that went something like, at the age of 26, Kate, though not promiscuous, had slept with most of the decent men in public life, right? So I thought, it was just there somewhere, and I couldn't really find it, but I remembered it because I thought, wait a minute. On the one hand, if you're reading very fast, you can't just read over that sentence and say, oh, yeah, so she slept with, and go to the next sentence. I mean, you have to pause for a minute. But if you pause too long, if you stop them too long, then it's just a smart-ass thing to say, which I didn't want either. You know what I mean? So there's this business of tuning sentences, which is such a sort of intriguing part of writing. I mean, not of all sorts of writing, but I don't have plots. I don't have other stuff. So all I can do is sort of that tinkering. But I looked at that sentence and I thought, yeah, now I can't find it. It's just...
Can I ask you, those are wonderful remarks you made. I wonder what you think of whistleblowers like Edward Snowden, for example. Do you find anything heartening in that story?
Yes.
Or not, according to the reaction?
Oh, I think he's just... I'm embarrassed by how positive I think about Edward Snowden. I feel about Edward Snowden, and I have a friend who's trying to, whom I highly respect, who's trying to bring Edward Snowden down. He's writing. So, just recently, I was telling Susan, I don't know how many of you saw the interview of John Oliver in Moscow with Edward Snowden. And first, the way it was described, it sounded like just talk about smartass. It just sounded so awful because it was about people's private parts and the National Security Agency and what Snowden thought of this, and that John Oliver had flown all the way to Moscow to ask him. And it sounded damned embarrassing, in a way, and vulgar and horrible. So I watched it. And there it was absolutely wonderful. First of all, Edward Snowden was late. And secondly, he was clearly embarrassed and ambushed by these questions. But he has a sense of humor, he's quick on his feet. And I was saying, Susan, this really struck me because there he is, and John Oliver starts asking him about, surveillance of people's private parts and whether they're circulated among agencies and also among private people. Yes, and under this section, yes. And he was blushing, and I thought there is no spy who is taught to blush, by his... I don't know, his control or whatever they call it. He was genuine and he was funny. So there was John Oliver talking about their dicks, and there was Edward Snowden talking about their junk. And this conversation was going on. It was really quite an important conversation because John Oliver had just asked people in the street, what do you think of Edward Snowden? And some people said, never heard of him. And other people said, oh yes, he's the spy. And other people said, oh, he's the one who sold our secrets. All right. Then, but most people had no idea and they couldn't care less. But of course, it depends who you select, but it looked like a pretty good selection. But then he said, what if they had pictures of your, as he said, dick, and were sort of circulating them among themselves and laughing and so forth? Well, they were so outraged. There were people in the street who said, I just sent a picture of mine to think that they would, So it turned out to be a question that mattered more to people than I would have thought. There it is. So, but I just love. You can see I love Edward Snowden.
Yes, as someone who has spent 34 years in a humble way working for employee rights, I certainly share some of your sense of despair. But one of the areas where I feel a lot of optimism is in the movement that's been made in gay rights and transgender rights and related.
I agree, yeah. And there's all this stuff that does sneak through. There are these wonderful developments in a way. And yet, in the scheme of things, even in the way the internet is developed, so in a way, theoretically, people have a voice. But there's always this totalitarian other side that is, I guess, in the days of Hollywood when people were pretty left-wing and people got subsequently blacklisted, they were only members of the Communist Party and wasn't that refreshing and wasn't that wonderful, and they cared for the poor and so on. And the next thing that happened is bang. And I'm not so sure it won't happen with gay rights too or any other hard-won privilege. Look at abortion. It was settled. Everybody, people who were fanatic and so forth had made their peace with it. This is the way it's going to go. They respected the courts. It was done. And then people started dredging it up as an issue again, and suddenly people thought maybe I'm obligated under my religion to care about it one way or the other again, or to be even outraged about it. And suddenly we have it back. It's almost unbelievable that issue came back. If that issue came back, any issue can come back. They can say, but were you not, or have you ever been a gay person or transgender? It's not unthinkable. I never thought of it before, I must say. And I can't really envision it, and yet I can. I can really, yeah.
There's certainly been, at least in my opinion, a regression in employee rights.
Has there?
Yes.
A regression already?
Yes.
But also, I don't know, I'm not proud of this, but I do get tired of a certain kind of claim. That is, a claim of racism meant one thing in the 1960s and before, and the 1970s again. But whatever it means now, Ferguson is not the same. I mean, there are racial questions, there are all kinds of questions, but they are not the same questions as people who have worked all their lives and are hanged because they want to vote. I mean, you can't pretend they're the same. And to have the present Attorney General and the present President talk as though, it set things back, in my view, you can't set them back. But it isn't genuine. It doesn't do for the President of the United States to say, when I see Trayvon, I see myself. When I see Trayvon Martin, or I see my son, it could have been my son. The point of being President of the United States, first of all, is that it's improper to make any such remark about anything. But secondly, if you're President of the United States, you have to see everyone or no one as yourself or your son. You can't suddenly, what is that? We're not in a schoolyard fight here. We have a country to run, and there's certain attitudes that are proper and plausible and genuine, and an emotional reaction that it might have been you. Well, sure, maybe Zimmerman might have been him too. Might have been any of us. All these people. It struck me with Newtown when there was the killer. Right, we had this killer, and I'm on this committee, but it hadn't. Anyway, what Newtown did. One of the things Newtown has done is destroyed the school and built another school exactly in its place. So that's $50 million. And someday, if they're archaeologists, they're going to say, in those days, people believed when somebody was murdered that the building was responsible. And now they've also destroyed the guy's house. And then there's a lot of talk about his motive. There wasn't any motive. He's sick. He kills people in a way. And, it's no point in saying he could have been my son. He could have been any of our sons, alas. And those children could have been any of our sons. If you don't believe that, then don't, but so now they're saying if only he'd received psychiatric treatment. Well, he did receive psychiatric treatment. It just didn't, and then if his mother had done something, he couldn't do something. He was 18. You can't. He was over 18. It's just, which raises another question for me, which doesn't have anything to do with anything, but the line between terrorism and being a nut is not so clear as we thought. A nut with an ideology. I'm ISIS, kids. Take this. It isn't. We've always pretended that was a real line. I'm not sure it is a very clear line. And once you get to the constituency of murderous nuts, well, we have enough terrorists without having to worry about the constituent of murderous nuts. How did I get there? I guess one of the reasons for writing is to try to stay on the page, if possible. Yeah.
I'd love to know what essayists and novelists and journalists, contemporary essayists and journalists and novelists you read and enjoy.
Well, Joan Didion, but that's easy, and Janet Malcolm, and that's easy. But those are not. But then, in another way, somebody who crossed somebody very early on is Edward J. Epstein. And Edward J., I don't know if any of you read Edward J. Epstein, because what he did is he sort of braved, he never writes polemically. He just crosses what anybody has said or believed or received ideas or common wisdom. So one of the things that happened is his first published thing was his master's thesis, and it was about the Warren Commission. I mean, you yawn right there, but he wrote about that, and what he said was they didn't do their job. I mean, he interviewed them, he did it very thoroughly, and then he and Richard Rovere, to ward off the book of this irresponsible lunatic Mark Lane, published Ed's book. And of course, Mark Lane's book went straight to the top of the bestseller list. It was a conspiracy and all that. So there's Ed. Then came a moment when the lawyer for the Black Panthers said there'd been a genocide. It was a slaughter, a genocide of 13 Black Panthers by the police. And then Ed, in his systematic way, went to each case. And it turned out that many of them were not dead. Most of them were not Panthers. It had nothing to do with anything. Luckily, it probably saved lives because the police, too, by then were thinking the only thing that was keeping the Panthers from killing everybody was that the police were killing Panthers. It wasn't so. Somebody had fallen under a fruit stand and so forth. After that piece came out, Abe Rosenthal, whom I loved and admired, and who was a boss of mine, called Mr. Shawn, whom I loved, and he said, "You are trying to murder me," or something. It was this tiny thing. Ed had taken issue with the press and had shown that 13 Black Panthers had not been killed. All the press had said they were. And so the press felt attacked by this notion that there were. So poor Ed has been exiled, in a way, ever since, until very recently, because he takes these contrarian positions. But so him, and then Walter Pincus, who's great. I mean, because Walter, who tells us real facts. I mean, there isn't a lot of, it's just there's thinking and there's facts. What else is there in nonfiction writing? Well, there's a hell of a lot else, and it isn't really nonfiction when you have that, I think. Well.
I want to talk about Speedboat, a book which I really love. From the afterword of Guy Turbay, he quoted you when you said, "I wanted to write the kind of book I like to read, which is narrative thrillers with plot, suspense, and dialogue, with characters and things going on, things which you wish to happen and things you do not." I found I didn't seem to be doing that, I thought. Well, now what do I do? My question is, before you even started writing Speedboat, when you were just thinking about it, what was your idea for it? Because it seems like from the quote that what you have written is very different from what you were thinking about of writing.
Oh, very different. And I never expected that this would happen, because people often say, I mean, to those of you who write, they always say, just don't worry about it, just write. Just sit down and write, because you can't be a writer unless you sit down and write. Just write anything. So you sit down and write, and then I thought, well, all right, where is it? And then I kept writing, and there wasn't what I read for. And then I thought, but wait a minute, every story is what I read for, so surely it will come, it will emerge, this story. And then it didn't. And then I thought there's a different kind of plot from the plot that is boy meets girl, boy wins girl, boy loses girl, whatever it is. There's a different kind of plot. And the whole question of suspense can be quite different. But with me, for example, I cannot tell a joke. And one of the reasons I cannot tell a joke is the punchline. That is, if you know the punchline, the whole thing is not to blurt it too early. Right? But with stories, one really wants to know the outcome. I really want to know the outcome. I cheat. When I was reading thrillers all the time, I always read to the end before I could go to sleep. I mean, not read to the end, read the end, which is certainly cheating. And then went to sleep, because otherwise I couldn't go to sleep. And then, of course, you have to read the part in between. But then I thought, look, if I'm writing this and I know the end, why would I withhold it? I mean, what is this stuff? I mean, why not tell the folks, they did not live happily ever after, or they did, or they didn't, or whatever. And then the whole thing sort of crumbled. So there began to be plots of sentences and plots, I hoped a different kind of development, but that's just an excuse really for what happened. But then I tried another thing, because I really wanted to be able to express feeling there. That is, I love soap operas, I cry at movies, and I really want to care about the outcome. So I just assume that happened with my work as well. And I remember saying this to Avedon. I said, I can't help it. I have this thing called, I think of as housemaid syndrome. I sat mesmerized by the same soap operas for the longest time, following them. I weep at this and that. And he said, without hesitation, he said, I hate that. And what he meant, I think, was that as a modernist, that stuff, you cut that stuff. That's kitsch, right? These cheap, sentimental appeals, you just cut to the stark reality, which has very few feelings in it. Whimsy, anger. That's about it. There isn't really with any true modernist, you don't. Well, I mean, the brilliant ones, say Kafka or Proust or Joyce, you don't really say, well, gee, I hope Marcel meets somebody even fancier tomorrow. It doesn't make any sense. It's just not what it's about. But it's not. It wouldn't be an intrusion of kitsch if that came. It's just not what interests him. It's not what interests Kafka. And it's not what interests Joyce. But so it isn't with modernists. But no other modernists are they. But Bartholomew, for example, can make a wonderful fantasy and a conceit and run on with it, and it's brilliant. But it hasn't got that thing of plot. And who was it? Somebody said, maybe it was Eliot or Yeats or somebody who said, look, the king died and then the queen died is a story. The king died and then the queen died of grief is a plot. And that seems to me just wonderful. But to have that knack of knowing where to put the plot part in the two consecutive sentences, I mean, don't tell us that she died of grief. It stands to reason she died of grief. What else did she die of? She wasn't hit by a car, and then suddenly, or that you don't have a story. So it's not so easy, that part, once you start worrying about it. And how can you not worry about it? You cannot worry about it if it comes naturally to you to tell the story the other way. But I have a feeling it comes naturally to me, too. I don't do it anyhow. But I would like to. So with Pitch Dark, I much better than Speedboat, though nobody else seems to. But there was some plot there. I mean, it seemed to me there was a clear plot there. And then odd things began to happen. People said, this is a love story that ends badly. And I thought, oh dear, I thought it ended pretty well. And then they said this person is called, her last name is Fine. I have trouble with names, enormous trouble with names. I just can't do it. Fine, F-E-I-N. And another place it was Fein, as short for faint, for the kind of feint that you do, F-E-I-N-T, maneuver. And it was one of the few names that meant anything to me. I think, I've not even looked it up since. I meant to look it up tonight. The word feign in plays, I would just as soon. I meant it to be certainly not fine and certainly not faint, but feign, I would just as soon, if it was anything. So you can't ask people to read what you thought you were writing. But the next one I'd like, really, I mean, I thought another novel when these happened. And I thought this time maybe I got closer to what I'd like to do. A whole other subject. Can you stand it or it's going on too long? A whole other subject. That is, they're the performing arts, right? You play your violin. There's no evidence that people are less good physically or technically at what they ever did. They can run faster. They can play. There's no reason to think people don't play the violin as brilliantly as they ever did. But the one thing, there's not even a word for it. There's the performing arts. But when I kept saying, what is the word for arts that produce something, an object, sculpture, painting, and then for that matter, a book or a composition, something solid, the performing artist dies, but the object, if he's created an object. So I said, what's the name for that kind of art? And they said, fine arts. Fine arts doesn't cover it. But with the fine arts, whatever that is, that creates an object, there's a directionlessness, I think. They can't, I mean, a violinist can play anything that ever was as movingly and as brilliantly as ever, but nobody can write the good stuff, that stuff anymore. You could say country and Western music, but it isn't going to be Schubert, it isn't going to be Mozart. And you can write novels, but they're not going to be Henry James, they're not going to be Dickens. And if you do, then you're not really of your time. It's a different enterprise, just different. So why can the artists producing something not keep up with the times why not? Right? And I think there came a moment when audiences began to identify with the auteur. It happened in film, and it may have happened in the other arts as well. That is, instead of having the suspension of disbelief and really believing in these characters in the book, they suddenly think, wait a minute, what's the author up to? And is it working, is it not working? And identifying with the author or the composer, and that's a kind of death of the relationship. It's a complete violation. I don't know what to do about it. Or who started it? Clearly, the creator started it. I mean, the audience didn't start thinking, wait a minute, Or critics. Critics were the worst. But you can't blame critics. I mean, what are they? But that is, do you find yourself quite often thinking, well, I know what that is, or I know what that is, but siding with the author, you don't want them siding with the author. You want them right there with that character. And with Pitch Dark, I hoped that was going to happen because I certainly cared about that character. And I hoped somebody else would. It just doesn't always work that way. In the next novel, I hope so, too. But there's no, yeah.
I just wondered whether that possibly was connected with our psychoanalytic thinking.
What a good idea. Of course it is. Of course it is. Yeah. What happened in his or her private life that accounts for this turn on the page? What a loss. Isn't it? It's an enormous loss. It's really interesting. Yeah. Yeah, well, then that innocence is lost, and it needs to come back, and it probably will come back, because people do love stories. And children certainly love stories. I mean, children...
But can't you do both at the same time? I mean, I still care about the characters.
Yeah, sure you can do both.
Yeah,
Sure
yeah.
you can do both at the time, but who? Who does both at the same time? I mean, yeah.
We didn't know what was going on in Joseph Conrad's private life until the letters were
Well, that's right, isn't it? And he, what a genius of... And it's not even his language, and he can do it. It's not even his language. And then Melville, I mean, who really cares about some whale and some maniac? And it's just so wonderful. And then even the short stuff, Bartleby. I was teaching in it just these kids had been sort of cheated of their education. They were seniors in college. It was quite a good college too. And I said, is there anything we can agree that we've all read? Silence. Then some hands went up. Toni Morris and Alice Walker. A lie, right? They'd been assigned that in every course they had. They hadn't read it. They thought they should have read it. I think. And then I said, is there anything we all know by heart? Silence, no. Somebody knew Shel Silverstein. Remember when we used to have to remember? Is anybody old enough to remember having to memorize terrible poems? Or even Oh Captain, My Captain? I mean, anything that everybody knew. On the shores of Gitche Gumi came the infant Hiawatha. I mean, it was so terrible. But children love to learn things by heart. And suddenly these kids had nothing by heart, except songs, which we all have by heart. And there was nothing they had all read. Finally, we settled on Goodnight Moon and went from there. And then went from there to Bartleby. And then it took me too long to notice that what they do when you give them an assignment, or what they did, is they went straight to the internet. It never occurred to them to read the originals. They've been doing it for a long time. So I'd suddenly get this stuff as, this story is about Eros and Thanatos. You know what? The story's about it's just a 5-page story. What do you mean it's just about? And then I said, no more secondary sources, no more internet. And then people did sort of read things. I mean, people will always read things, but not in that natural way. I have a friend who, well, no, he's dead. I had a friend who was teaching at St. Bernard's School in New York, and he said, we must not have any book reports. And the teacher said, what do you mean no book reports? And he said, we don't want to ruin their reading for them. While they're reading, let them just read. Because it's a pleasure reading. I mean, surely it's a pleasure. It's a physical pleasure in addition to everything else. So they never did have book reports, and I thought that's right. You certainly don't want people racing to the internet and finding what the critic Buzzy D says about Eros and Thanatos.
Well, we have time for one last question, if there is one.
There isn't.
All right, well.
Thank you. Thank you.